Hello everyone, I'm Karen Wright, and on behalf of the Stevenson Trust for Citizenship, I am delighted to welcome you here for the 2015 Mackenzie Lecture in Politics. This year we are very honored to have as our lecturer Professor Mark Blyth, who is going to talk to us about a subject that is something that he knows a great deal about and something that is in the core of public debate currently in Scotland and around the world, and that is austerity. He is going to talk to us about austerity in the politics of money, a disconsolate analysis. We are also very lucky to have been able to be joined by Professor of Economics and Principal of the University of Glasgow, Anton Muscatelli, who has a wide-ranging set of contributions both to his academic discipline of economics and also to the public use of economics. Most recently, he just told me he was appointed to the Scottish Commission of Economic Advisors. So we have someone who actually has a direct line to perhaps the way things might be decided here in Scotland. This is the first time that the Stevenson Trust and the Mackenzie Lecture in Politics have joined forces, but this is also a very fitting partnership, if you will, because William Mackenzie, for whom the lectureship is named, was a long-standing and ardent supporter of the Stevenson Trust and had a strong belief in the importance of university staff engaging with the broader community. And that is the remit of the Stevenson Trust. We aim to bring insight and analysis to the issues of the day on local, national, and international levels. And we aim to do so in a way that is open to all, open to members of the public and citizens of Glasgow, as well as students and staff of the University of Glasgow. Okay. And I see a good mix of all those folks in the audience. I think the staff may have been slightly inundated by reminders today for which we have apologies. One of the things that I'd like to do is make a couple of quick notes. I'm not going to talk for long, and then I will turn it over to the principal. Just a quick say that as you can probably see, the proceedings tonight are being filmed, and in order for that to go forward, we are presuming that your presence here confers your consent for that filming. The second thing I just want to mention is that in any effort to put together something like this, there's usually someone who is a driving force who may not be as publicly seen, but without whose efforts that event would not be possible. And in our case, that's Mirto Takasika, for whom we are extremely grateful, for whose efforts we are extremely grateful. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Anton Muscatelli, who for most of us here in the university needs no particular introduction, but I do want to say needs no particular introduction beyond knowing that he is a widely noted economist and principal here at the University of Glasgow. But I do want to make a quick note of Professor Muscatelli's interest in and support for the work of the Stevenson Trust over the years, and more broadly for the support for the engagement of the University of Glasgow with the wider community. So thank you. And Professor Muscatelli.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I'm particularly delighted to be here this evening for the Mackenzie Lecture sponsored by the Stevenson Trust by Mark Blyth. I think the debate that's currently surrounding austerity, I think, is one of the most important public policy debates happening at present across the world. One reason why I'm particularly keen to be here and really looking forward to Mark's lecture is that he takes in all his work deliberately takes a political economy perspective. And I do strongly believe that macroeconomic debates cannot simply be understood in purely economic theory terms, in terms of pure economic models. One has to understand not only the politics of the time, but also one has to understand the historical context within which these macroeconomic ideas are born. I suppose a perfect example of that was Keynes's development of his general theory in 1936, which was really the culmination of a number of years over which he developed understandings of the economic crisis that hit many of the major economies of the world in the 1930s. And indeed, if one looks at the way in which macroeconomics has developed since 1945, one sees that the ideas in macroeconomics tend to ebb and flow with what is happening politically, historically, economically. So you have periods of relative macroeconomic stability, as for example we saw in the mid to late 50s all the way to the late 60s, or indeed as we saw from the 1990s into the early 2000s. And during that time, you see a development of consensus in macroeconomics. You see different schools of thought coming together, developing what you might call consensus model. But then you look at periods of macroeconomic instability, such as what happened in the late 60s into the early 70s, and you begin to see that political consensus shattered with rival schools of thought. So in the late 60s, we saw monetarism emerging. We saw a new classical school emerging, which said the economy is self-equilibrating, no need for government to get in there. And rival schools emerging as well, the new Keynesian and Keynesian view of the world in the 1970s, saying, no, the economy isn't self-equilibrating. And we're seeing similar divisions, of course, occurring now in the wake of the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2009. We're now seeing very divergent economic ideas and models. So this is why I think a political economy perspective really does matter. Macroeconomic models are not born in a historical vacuum. Now, I have to confess, and I should say up front, I'm not a neutral observer in all of this. Some of you may have seen that I have written against some of the recent austerity-led policies in Europe, especially in Europe. It seems to me that one of the major messages that comes to us from economic history is the fact that the lack of effective demand in industrialized economies is something which is one of the key problems in deep recessions, especially following a major financial crisis, as we have experienced over the last few years. So effective demand often is the biggest factor constraining recovery. And austerity policies actually sometimes are self-defeating because they can actually make things worse at a time if they do constrain domestic demand. Particularly at a time like this, if you see in countries like not only the UK, but across Europe, where governments can borrow at pretty much negative real interest rates over long periods of time, it does really question as to whether the right policy is to cut spending, especially in capital infrastructure, which could in fact add to productivity in the long run. So as a very partial rather than a neutral observer, I'm looking forward to what Mark has to tell us this evening. I'm particularly, as I say, fascinated by his work, which takes a particular political economy perspective. It avoids the myth that economists sometimes develop around their models, and as I say, avoids developing this in a political vacuum. I think one of the really interesting things is that we've seen over the last few years is how people have questioned whether economics as a discipline has got it right. I think I take Paul Krugman's view. I think he expressed it in a recent interview where he says, well, actually, I think we were expecting a bit too much from economics. I think if you treat economics as a science as opposed to a social science, then you're bound to be disappointed. I think what we need to understand as economists is, as I say, the historical and political context. So over to you, and over to Stephen, rather, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Principal, and ladies and gentlemen. Stephen White, Department of Politics. Just another couple of words, and then we can get on to our speaker. I'd like to say just a word or two about the fact that this is a rather complex arrangement with both Stevenson and the Mackenzie Lecture engaged. I particularly speak for the Mackenzie Lecture, which we've sought to promote in the Department of Politics for some years now. Bill Mackenzie was a professor in our department. He had achieved a great deal already in Manchester and built up a school of government there, but he came here in the late 1960s, about the same time as I came as a graduate student, though I wasn't his own graduate student. He began to develop a postgraduate community, and he began to make appointments. I was one of the people that he appointed at that time, and he nurtured what we think of as something distinctive and important in terms of the study of politics here at Glasgow, as he had done elsewhere. He began to write. We think he wrote more at Glasgow than he'd done, in fact, ever before. Remarkably, he published a book even 4 years after he died, which isn't given to most of us, I think, but of course it had been written a great deal earlier and delayed by official secrecy from publication. Bill was a figure who made a great impression. There will be some people here who've known him personally, as I've done. Bulky, eyebrows that moved up and down, eyes that twinkled. You never quite knew what he was thinking, and in particular, he had a very strange grunt. We never knew whether he was agreeing vehemently with the speaker or disagreeing vehemently with the speaker, and it was sometimes a little bit disturbing. But at any rate, we're greatly attached to him. Since we're speaking of economics, I can say he didn't unfortunately leave a large endowment that would have allowed us to continue his work through the lecture, but he left, I think, something much more valuable, which is an intellectual legacy, the people that he encouraged, that he brought on, that he appointed, and the work that he's left us of covering a whole range. So this is a Bill Mackenzie lecture as well as a Stevenson lecture. My other duty is to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is a Scot, as you'll discover, from Dundee. Our speaker is a Glasgow graduate, but not a Glasgow University graduate, I have to say. Our speaker has those, what I think of as particularly Scottish virtues. He speaks forcefully and plainly and coherently. He doesn't, I think, follow fashion particularly. He speaks his mind in a way that many of us find an attractive feature of Scotland. At least certainly I do. He's, as I say, he was a graduate of Strathclyde. He went on to graduate study in the United States and has ended up at an Ivy League university. I think Mark would allow me to say that he's a prize-winning author. In particular, his book on austerity has won a whole series of prizes, and I think, given the theme of his lecture, given austerity, I can mention that we will be able to make copies of a flyer available here at the lecture that will secure you a copy of the book if you'd like to hear more from Mark at a most advantageous price. I think one that fully reflects the difficult nature of our times, so to speak, making its own little contribution to the fight against austerity. So it's with enormous pleasure that I invite Mark to address us now. He's already spoken to the department. He's been around town. We look forward to continuing our discussions with him at the drinks that will follow the lecture and later on. So, Mark, enormous thanks for coming. You have, I think, a very warm welcome. You have a very large and mixed audience, and we look forward to what you'll tell us now. So,
thank you very much. Principal, professors, colleagues, friends, neighbours and others, it's nice to be home. Let me begin with a lovely story. Just because it's a brilliant story, I just love telling the story. It's my favourite story about Glasgow. So in the 1960s, when they were expanding higher education from 12 to 40 universities, around the time of the Labour government of 64, Strathclyde was then King's College, or King's Royal Technical College, or something like this. It had been around since the 1700s, and they were going to be made one of the new universities. So the guy who ran the shop at that time had a nemesis. Now, in academia, it's one of the few places left in this world where you're allowed to have a nemesis, right? So this guy's nemesis was an economist. It's funny how that happens. And he thought, all right, I'm going to stuff this guy. So he put him on the committee to name the university because he knew this would drive him ballistic. Because these are these types of committees that basically everybody talks, even if they have nothing to say, sucks up an inordinate amount of time, nothing gets done, blah, blah, blah. So he thought he was sticking him on one. So, of course, the guy took the committee over. So this is how it works out. Everybody's talking about all the possible names. Like, University of Cowcaddens, no, scratch that, right, you know. And eventually he says, look, you're missing this one. Glasgow is a famous city, and there's 2 universities here. Well, what's your point? Well, who are we? We're the technical guys. James Watt, Boyle's Law, all that stuff was done here, right? Now, who's the mob up the road? Who? Glasgow. What do? Arts, literature, classics, law. So think about it. Where else in this world do you get one city, 2 famous universities, one's the old one that does all that stuff, the other one's the technical school, and somebody gets it. Oh my God, it's MIT and Harvard. We're the new Cambridge. This is brilliant. So of course the meme is released, it goes round the committee, everybody buys it, hook, line and sinker. And he says, have you given any thought to what you'd like to call it? He says, well, we should play on the kind of MIT thing. So what are you thinking of? The Scottish Higher Institute of Technological Excellence. Without missing a beat, they wrote a press release and sent it to the Evening Times. That evening, the Evening Times published the following headline: next year, King's College to become shite. Now, I have no idea whether that story is true or not. But you know the wonderful thing about Glasgow? It could be true. And there are very few places in this world where that could be true. And that's why it's good to be back home. Now, with all of that, I just really wanted to tell you that story because I love it. All right, so let's go on with this. Austerity, the Politics of Money, a Disconsolate Analysis. The title was actually given to me by Stephen. We had another title, and it had to do with the independence stuff, and that's kind of like passé now, I think. So basically, let's do this instead. So he gave me the title. This is what we're going to do. All right, let's get started. So why be disconsolate? Two wrong diagnoses, and you hear this all the time, and George Osborne wheels out a version of this all the time. So this is Wolfgang Schäuble. 2011 in the Financial Times. It is an undisputable fact that excessive state spending has led to unsustainable levels of debt and deficits that now threaten our economic welfare. Piling on more debt now will stunt rather than stimulate growth in the long run. 2015, the problem is that Greece has lived beyond its means for a long time and no one wants to give them any more money without guarantees. You've heard this. Now, this is the 5-year moving average of euro area government debt to GDP combined. It's flat. In fact, it's going down into the crisis. So where's the orgy of overspending? Interestingly, it comes around here in 2008. What happened in 2008? Do you remember anything? Might be like a giant global financial crisis where the entire global financial system got bailed at the taxpayer's expense. That might have something to do with a large increase in debt. Now, there's the Greeks. Well, we know they overspent, right? I mean, the Greeks, right? I mean, seriously, whatever. Well, actually, their biggest debt buildup is actually long before this becomes a problem. And in fact, if you have a look at this, they're pretty much flat going into the crisis. In fact, even the Greeks didn't overspend. But there was an overspend. Now, how can you have an overspend if people aren't spending? Let's have a look. Why are debts going up if the mantra is cut, cut, cut? You have to pay your debts, otherwise your debts will go down. Here's an interesting little thing. What you have here is the degree of austerity, how much you're tightening your budget. And here we have the change in the debt ratio. So what have you got up here? Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain. So what's this telling us? The greater degree of budgetary austerity, the greater the increase in the debt. That's that line going up. Now, why does this work? Well, basically, it's a denominator problem. If your economy is the denominator in the sum and you hack away large parts of it, the same amount of debt, the numerator, has to get bigger rather than smaller. It's a simple reciprocal relationship. You can have a look at this another way. You see the same thing, the degree of budgetary tightening. And then here's the growth of GDP. Look, it becomes negative really quick. Again, there's Greece. It's lost about 30% of GDP, and its debts have gone up 40%, despite doing more cuts than anyone else. So the more you cut in a crisis, the bigger your debt gets, because your underlying economy gets smaller rather than larger. Now, if it's baloney, therefore, that spending caused the crisis, what actually did? This is my favorite picture in the world. This is the greatest moral hazard trade in human history. So what are you looking at? You're looking at the 10-year bond yields of different European sovereigns going into the crisis. And then the stable part here is when you're in the euro, and then this is the crisis kicking off. So there's Greece, right? You're getting 25% for holding Greek debt back in the 1990s. 25% rate of return. But even there, look, think about theirs, where's Germany, let's see, where's Italy? Italy's around there. You're getting around 12% for holding Italian and French debt. Why is it so risky? It's not as if France is going to go bankrupt in the mid-1990s. Well, there was a few problems, and one of them was, when you have your own currency, you've got what's called exchange rate risk. You can devalue it. And there's also inflation risk, because you can print your own money. So when we had this wonderful idea called the euro, it was signaling to financial markets that essentially you're going to get rid of these problems. So you can strip that risk out of the bond. So rationally then, the markets price in, as the euro comes in, that the yields are going to go down and down and down. That's a nice story. It's kind of true, but there's another story that goes like this as well. Imagine you're a big bank, and you're getting 12% rate of return for holding one of these things. And you know that source of easy profits is going to disappear. You also like holding sovereign debt, because sovereign debt is highly rated. It forms the base of your funding pyramid. The more of it you have, the more of it you can pledge as collateral and borrow in what's called repo market financing. It's really useful stuff, and it's all going to get more expensive because the price of the bond goes up as the yield goes down. So this is a bit weird. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to bloat up your balance sheet. You're going to buy as many of these bonds as you can before everybody else does. And you're going to expand the size of your footprint of your bank, and you're going to lever up and generate lots and lots of debt. And as you're doing so, what you're doing is called a convergence trade. You're buying the bond as it's declining, but you're bloating your balance sheet at the same time. So what's happening is as all these banks are trying to buy the same amount of debt, it's getting cheaper. The yields are going down. The interest rates are going down. In 2001, when the euro comes in, the European Commission passes a directive that says that for the function of repo transactions, how banks fund themselves, they basically borrow overnight from wholesale markets and then renew it every single day. And they pledge sovereign debt in order to get the cheap financing. Then they lend it to you as a mortgage for 30 years. That's basically how it works. 70% of bank funding in the Eurozone is done on what's called repo transactions. The European Commission basically said all the sovereign debt will be treated the same. This is how Greece became Germany. It was both by convergence and then by edict. Now, why is this a moral hazard trade? Well, imagine that I'm a French bank. Let's say I'm called Crédit Agricole, for example, a farmer's bank. How much damage can you do? Well, if you double the size of your balance sheet and you double your operating leverage, and suddenly you are very, very big, and the Bank of France no longer has the franc, and it borrows euros essentially from a foreign country, what would happen if that bank got into trouble? Who would bail it out? You don't have a printing press anymore. So you'd go to your national regulator and say, I'm afraid I'm in the bit of the poo, can you please help me out? And you would say, that's not my problem, mate, I don't have a printing press anymore. You'll have to ask the ECB. So everyone was presuming that the ECB was, in a sense, the lender of last resort, the crisis manager. Unfortunately, it wasn't. It was basically a currency board with an inflation target, and it was still fighting an inflation which died in 1924, quite successfully in 2007. So, when the crisis kicks off, everybody starts to price nationally what was held to be one common bond. Suddenly, those bank funding structures which use the sovereign debt to fund themselves becomes really risky, because what do the rating agencies do? They start to downgrade the sovereign debt, which means that you're downgrading the assets that the entire banking system of Europe is based upon. Whoops! What does this do? By 2011, it shows us these are the combined consolidated claims, holdings of assets of France, the Netherlands, Portugal, interestingly, and Germany, on Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, right? So basically, this is how much stuff from the south is on the balance sheet of those banks. Have a look at France. 33% of GDP, equivalent value to 1/3 of the size of the French economy, is basically crappy assets from the south. 20% in the case of Germany. So this is a banking crisis. It's always been a banking crisis. Have a look at this. Ugly, but informative. Share lent to the troubled south in total lending by each country. Notice how there's hardly anything going in 97. The euro comes in, boom. Suddenly the Germans are giving 20% of their total lending out to the periphery. And look at the periphery, what are they doing? Greece is getting 40% of its lending from the core. So, what happens in Germany is you've got a bunch of old people who save too much. They take it to the Sparkasse. The Sparkasse gives it to Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank buys Greek debt with it, and then that basically sends money to the south for them to buy German products. And it was all working so well until the Americans had a financial crisis and screwed the whole thing up. Because then the capital flows from north to south stopped. It's called a sudden stop. And the whole thing comes out of kilter. Because all that funding for lending that the banks are doing, you now have a credit crunch. How are you going to fund yourself when you're levered 40-1 and your underlying base capital's lost value? This is the real reason we bailed out the periphery. You hear all the stuff about what we gave to Greece, what we gave to Portugal, blah, 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 the rest of it. Have a look at this. Periphery lending was indirect bank bailouts to the core banks for prior over-lending to the periphery. Greece got 274.5 billion. Ireland, 85, and another 47 in promissory notes, blah, 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 490. 420 went right back to the banks. It was a bank bailout. That was it. You couldn't tell your public. Right? You couldn't actually come out and say, actually, what we're really doing is bailing out Commerzbank. How do you feel about that? No, we have to invent this narrative about the Greeks being lazy and so on and so forth. So you poison the well of European politics because you can't tell the truth about a bank bailout. So this creates a very interesting problem. Whereas the Americans had a too big to fail problem, or too big to jail, what you've got in Europe is a too big to bail problem. Because you've got an entire interlinked financial sector right across the whole continent. And everybody's borrowing in a currency that none of them get to print. That's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a Latin America type problem where everybody's borrowing dollars and then you're using your own local currency. So when funding dries up for these banks, this isn't one country's problem. This is a continental problem, but there's no continental institutions to deal with it except the ECB, who under Trichet think that they're still fighting an inflation from the 1920s and their job is not to act as a lender of last resort. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a crisis. Now, for comparison, here's the too big to fail USA. So there's American GDP in 2012, and here's the assets of their banking sector. So the top 5 banks basically come to about 61% of GDP. You have your own currency. It's the dollar. Everybody wants to hold it. Remarkable thing about the crisis. Started in the United States, the dollar went up during the crisis because it's all anybody wanted to hold. A remarkable thing number 2, despite being the source of this financial crisis, yields on 10-year treasuries have went down and down and down and down since 2006 because it's all people want to hold. Now, at the end of the day, if one of those banks goes over, it's going to be ugly for the United States. It could take out 10% of GDP, but it's 10% of 17 trillion. And they get to print the global reserve asset, and they are under no illusions whatsoever about the function of a central bank, which is a lender of last resort. Have a look at France. There's French GDP. There's the top 3 bank assets. There's total bank assets. They don't have a printing press. That's a problem. And that was a continent-wide problem, because who's going to bail a system that's too big to bail? Total bank assets, GDP for the Eurozone, including the Brits. That's how big your financial sector is relative to your economy. So sympathy for the Germans here. Think about this for a moment. 2012, total bank assets for the EU are about 44 trillion euros. The underlying economies are about 16 trillion. The German economy is about 3.5 trillion. How on earth does 3.5 bail 44? It's not going to do it. So the Germans have been playing a simple game. Squeeze, add liquidity, and pray. And that's what we've been doing. Fortunately, the prayers weren't getting through. Things were getting worse. So if it's not about spending and it's about overlending, and the creditors don't want to take a hit for it, how should we think about this? So here's when it really comes, the rubber hits the road. Back in 2008, this is the American crisis. This is what really happened. Highly levered financial institutions, big banks, fund at repo at about 50%. They basically borrow overnight and lend 30 years and renew it overnight, pledging collateral. The collateral of choice was all those mortgages, asset-backed commercial paper. Why were they using asset-backed commercial paper? Because there weren't enough treasury bills to go around. So all the debt hawks in the United States freaking out about the amount of debt. One of the reasons that they had using mortgages is because they couldn't get enough sovereign stuff. Why couldn't they get enough sovereign stuff? Where is the largest pile of American sovereign debt in the world? China, exactly. It's sitting in China. So they started to use mortgages. Subprime devalues the collateral. The collateral calls when people basically say, hey, that's now worth half of what it was. You need to give me twice as much to get the same amount of funding, right? This basically starts a shadow bank run and starts a bank run to laymen. And then there's a blessing. America has big capital markets, so there's other places to take stuff out of the banks and dump it and so on and so forth. But basically, they got a bailout from the Fed. Now, here's what happens in 2011 through 2013. The figure for repo funding in the EU is about 70%. As I mentioned, the collateral of choice is euro-denominated sovereign debt. That starts to get downgraded. So it gets harder for the banks to fund their money. They get shut out of US money market paper in May 2011, and by November, the yields spike and hit boons. And so long as the German bond, the 10-year bond, was trading down as the safety asset and everybody else was going up, the Germans didn't care. In November, boons started to go up, which was basically, danger, Will Robinson, it's time to do something. Luckily, they just changed the head of the central bank. That's the game changer, because the too big to fail system suddenly gets a bailout. This is Mr. Draghi. This is the Draghi put. So what happens? Long-term financial reoperation, €1 trillion are dumped into the European banking circuits. Then, you don't believe me? I'll dump another $500 billion. You really don't believe me? I'll give you nearly another half. And then I'll make a promise to do whatever it takes. So here's the run-up in the Italian 10-year. There's LTRO1, there's LTRO2, there's the promise to do whatever it takes. That's the Italian bond yield, which is actually now down here. Was there any point in all that austerity the periphery had to do? No, because look at two countries that haven't done a single bit of austerity. France is now 4% budget deficit, which is the main reason Spain is growing. They've got someone to actually export to. So you have a look at all the sacrifices that were made in Portugal and Ireland and all the rest of these places. What's that blue line? That's their debt profile. What's the black line? That's the bond yield. Now, this is meant to be positively correlated. So basically, you're meant to pay more for your debt the more debt you have. They have more debt and their yields are on the floor. Why? Because the central bank saved the banking system by dumping all that money into it. Everybody used the free money from the ECB to buy those bonds. The action of buying those bonds is another convergence trade, and all the yields went from high down to nothing. Spanish bond trader in London, when this was going on, told me there was even a rhyme that people said about this when they were doing it. It's brilliant. You buy at 1 and you borrow at 1 and you buy at 10. You use the spread to bury the dead. You bank it at 4 and repo more, and then go knock on the ECB's door. And that's exactly what everybody did, and it was tremendously successful. Now, there was one part of the story that you never hear about, which was what meant to happen next. Because how do you get out of a debt crisis when you've generated a huge amount of debt? Whoops. And that is a huge amount of debt. Well, what you're meant to do is something called financial repression. And how do you do that? It's a weird term, but basically what it means is you're going to inflate your debt away. So how are you going to do this? Well, you got all your local bonds and local banks, and then you basically drop what's called the coupon payment, and you lengthen the maturities out to infinity, and then you run a positive inflation, and basically inflation eats away the value of the debt. This is what we did after World War II in this country. Within 10 years, a third of our debt after World War II was gone. Nobody even noticed. It's defaulting by inflation. They wanted to do that, but there was a problem. Austerity had been so severe that they damaged the demand side of the European economy so much that the supply side had shifted. And they got into a lower equilibrium where they couldn't generate a positive inflation. So then plan A wasn't working. You're going to have to get a plan B to get out of the mess that you're in. And that's what they've been putting in place for the past 2 years, a new plan B. Now, how much did it cost to keep all this afloat before we get to what the plan actually is? This is from Oliver Wyman's report from August 2013 about basically what's been going on in Europe. Total state support approved for the EU financial sector total more than 5 trillion euros, equivalent to 40% of Eurozone GDP. Of capital injected into banks to keep them afloat, only about 10% of the original capital has been repaid. Otherwise insolvent banks have been recapitalized, and the monetary policies of the ECB and national central banks have allowed themselves to do this at low cost. Has anybody voted on this? Has there been a single vote in a single parliament authorizing 5 billion of spending? That's astonishing when you think about it, isn't it? Sorry, not 5 billion, 5 trillion. I know. I mean, 5 billion's big enough, but like 5 trillion, I mean, come on. Now, go back to that slide that I showed you with like basically the French by 2011 had 33% of GDP in toxic assets in their banks, and they've got 3 big banks that constitute 300% of GDP. It's not a nice picture. These are the figures that PricewaterhouseCoopers put together, which includes all the numbers from the asset quality review, the stress test they just did, plus the non-systemically important banks. The most important part is here, 1.220. That's $1.2 trillion, 2 trillion euros in non-performing exposures, loans, in the European banking system. Go back to that example I gave you earlier. You got the Germans sitting there about 3.6 trillion euros for their economy. A banking system has 1.22 trillion in non-performing loans. Let's say half of them come good, but half of them go bad. That means that if Germany is the treasury, if people expect it to be the leader of last resort, the lender of last resort, rather than the central bank, they're meant to eat basically the equivalent of about 40% of German GDP in bad loans. That's never going to happen, and it's totally unreasonable to expect them to do it. So what's then the solution? How do you get these bad assets off the books? We're going to get there. Now, all of this is a problem because what's happened is the underlying base capital of the banking system's lost value. The sovereigns that house these banks can't inflate because they don't have their own currency. They can't liquidate because that would be defaulting, and they don't want to do that because it'll blow up the economy. And they can't do a devaluation trick. Austerity, as I showed you, shrinks GDP and makes debts bigger and yields greater until you basically dump huge amounts of liquidity and the yields go down. And you're trying to get banks to lend and investors to invest in the midst of a policy-induced recession. So what's going on here? At the end of the day, there was a crazy funding model for the European banking system. Nobody was really in charge. They lent far too much to a bunch of people who were never going to pay it back. The system was incredibly vulnerable to shocks. They had a shock. They got into trouble. They spent 2 years doing the wrong thing. And then finally, they stuck a huge amount of public money in the system to stabilize it. That's where we are. So what's the politics of money that come out of this? Go back to the 1970s. As was mentioned in the introduction by the principal, the 1970s was an interesting period. Many of us lived through it. I was a youngster in those days, but I still remember the 3-day week. I remember candles, I remember the strikes, I remember out-of-control Labour, I remember the election of Margaret Thatcher, I remember all the good music from the 1980s, all that sort of great stuff, right? It was a terrible decade, it was completely untenable, we had to change everything. There is no alternative. Remember that one? That's the deal? Right. Here's a weird thing, if you go back and look at it. You had positive inflation. You had relatively moderate to high inflation. It's quite interesting. Labour's share of national income in the 1970s was at an all-time high. Interesting. We, Labour, took home more of national income than we'd ever done in history. Corporate profits right throughout the West were at an all-time low. Unions were very strong. Inequality was low. Finance was weak. It was still in its post-Bretton Woods box. Central banks were weak. They were check-cashing agencies for the Treasury. And parliaments were strong and politics was national. Then that thing that couldn't hold, you know, there is no alternative way to change all that. What did we do? We changed it all. So you have the whole neoliberal revolution. And what do you end up with? Secular disinflation. Basically, ruthless product market integration and deregulation meant that prices for stuff has fallen dramatically. This is actually very interesting because it's one of the reasons that wages have stagnated, because basically I don't need to give you a real wage increase if prices keep falling. It's the Walmart effect. So long as prices get cheaper, your real wage is actually going up, or at least it looks like that, so long as you can pull that trick off. Capital share of income is at an all-time high. Thank you, Thomas Piketty, for reminding us of this. Labour's, reciprocally, is at a low point. We've never taken home less. Wages have stagnated. Unions are weak everywhere. Markets have globalized, which means price effects are amplified through the system. Finance has never been stronger. Central banks have never been stronger. And parliaments are weak. As you know, they spend most of their time talking bullshit about immigration and basically tweeting to each other. Which is true. I mean, really, they are useless. Now, segue for a minute. What is money? If you do a basic econ course, I'll tell you there's 3 things. It's a means of exchange. Yeah, something has to be the numerator, something has to denominate everything else. It's a unit of account. It's very useful for counting stuff, right? And it's a store of value. Now, a friend of mine that I write with is a guy called Eric Lonergan. He's a hedge fund manager. Oh, yes, I have friends who are hedge fund managers. They're not all bastards. And he defines actually money as a hedge against uncertainty. It's a lovely way of thinking about it, because why do we value cash? Because we don't know what tomorrow will bring, and therefore if you have something that you can save, which you can then exercise an option on, it gives you optionality over the future, then it's a wonderful device. It allows intergenerational credit and transfers and all. It's a fantastic thing. Money's awesome, right? But the problem is, if you don't know what the future's going to bring, the question is, will the paper be worth anything when we get there? The traditional problem of inflation and so on and so forth. But just think of this as a kind of an uncertainty problem. You don't know if the money is going to be worth it when you get there, so what's the point in saving the money? Now, let's switch back to the politics for a minute. Social scientists who study sort of politics often talk about collective action. So what's the insight here? Have you ever gone out to dinner with 12 people and tried to pay the bill in a restaurant? You're immediately aware of the politics of collective action, because somebody will be a free rider, right? They will try and hide, right? They're usually the person that's had the 4 extra gin and tonics as well, right? So, you know, there's that problem. Then there's the coordination problem involved in it. Just basically, oh, who had the lasagna, you know, all that sort of shit, right? But basically, what it means is in large groups, the optimal contribution of effort of any individual declines as a function of the marginal benefit you get from it. So it makes sense for everybody to wait for somebody else to do it, right? Now, this is a wonderfully robust, powerful theory, but it also runs up against some obvious things like facts, because people do act collectively. They do act purposefully. You just went through 2 years of referendum debate, which is all about collective action. So obviously this stuff happens. But what I want to suggest is the politics in the 1970s, which took place under a period of inflation, produced a very different politics from what we've got just now, which is a period of deflation. So let me walk you through this. In 1943, there was a guy called Mikhail Kalecki, and he wrote a wonderful article. It's 7 pages long in Political Quarterly, and it's called The Political Aspects of Full Employment. And he pointed out a problem with the Keynesian revolution that was about to be unleashed on the world. And he says, imagine that you can actually get full employment all the time. What's that going to do? It's going to squeeze corporate profits, because wages will be able to go up and up and up, because the costs of changing a job will decline to zero. So basically, you will end up screwing capital, and then they will go on an investment strike. They will refuse to invest, and then you're going to have huge economic problems. My goodness, was that man prescient, because that was pretty much what happened in the 1970s. So what happens here, in an inflationary period, particularly if you're talking about people who own paper assets, you're taking money from them. Inflation is a class-specific tax or an asset-specific tax. Because if I'm sitting with an interest-bearing instrument that pays 4% and inflation's now 5%, I've just lost. Now, people say, oh, but inflation hurts the poor the most and all that. You know, the only people who ever make that argument are rich people with lots of paper assets. Because the poor can get redress through governments. Pensioners can get redress because they vote. Right? Try cutting pensions and see how far you get. That's not going to work too well, is it? So, in that case, it's capital's interest that get put on the chopping block. So they mobilize, they get organized, and basically you have the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions. Capital's interests are clear in an inflation. Labour is on the defensive, but is increasingly fragmented. Technology changes in geography where stuff is made. Remember the whole decline of the traditional industries here on the Clydeside, right? The neoliberal offensive takes place at the level of ideas and institutions. There is no alternative. We need to have an independent central bank. Inflation's more important than unemployment. You can't really do anything about long-run growth through government intervention, etc., right? The state is weakened and finance is ascendant. And this is why Reagan and Thatcher and Blair and Cameron are all of one colour and one cloth. But when you're in a disinflationary period, you get what I call Polanyi's revenge. And what's that? There's a fallacy of composition at the level of interest formation. What on earth does that mean? Imagine the following. You're in a deflation, prices are going down. If you're a businessman, you don't know if that's a local event specific to you or a global event. And if you did know it was a global event, it's not going to do you any good because there's nothing you can do about it. So what do you do if you don't want to go out of business when people aren't buying as much? You have a sale. So if you have a sale, what happens to everybody else? They have a sale too. What have you just done? You've all just pushed down the price level and made it worse. What happens if you're Labour and you're like, oh, there's unemployment? We go, well, I'll work for less. I'll price myself into a job. I'll get on my Norman Tebbit bike and go off and I'll price myself into a job. Well, individually rational, collectively disastrous, because what happens if everybody tries to price themselves into a job? Consumption collapses and you end up with more unemployment. So there's a really different politics, because your first best effort to make yourself better off produces second best outcomes for everybody. So whereas in this world, basically, capital's interests are clear. Here, they're not so clear, because everybody's getting screwed. And that's the politics of deflation. In such periods, what you get are anti-creditor coalitions led by the state. It's not the capitalist taking over the state to rewrite the rules to be capital-friendly. That was the 70s. It's now. And what does now look like? Creditor-debtor standoffs at the level of the state, domestic austerity, and internationally, the Eurozone crisis. And what do you get as a reply? The Front National, Podemos, Syriza, the SNP, Sinn Féin, all anti-austerity. They may have different flavours. Some of them may be nationalistic and xenophobic, some may be cosmopolitan and liberal, but ultimately they're coming up against the same thing. So we live in a very, very interesting period politically. This is the politics of money we're dealing with. Now, if this is the politics of money, how should we think about the past 8 years? Well, part of it, related to the greatest moral hazard trade in human history, is the greatest bait and switch in human history, whereby the private debts of the banking system were essentially socialized and replaced with public debt. And how does that work? Well, basically you scream too big to fail, you get a bailout, you get recapitalized, you've got direct infusions of taxpayer cash, but more importantly, you get a whoppingly large recession, which is interlinked across the globe, and everything's sort of so tightly coupled, it's pro-cyclical, so you end up with a very deep recession. What happens then? Well, basically your tax receipts drop as your levels of transfers go up, you're paying more unemployment, taking less in, your deficit widens, you fill in the gap with, guess what, debt, and your debt profile goes up. It's kind of automatic and kind of had to happen. But why is it a greatest bait and switch? Because here's the real thing we don't like to talk about on this. What usually happens when private debt becomes public debt, if you go back to, for example, the savings and loan crisis in '86 in the United States, 1,000 bankers went to jail. In this crisis, apart from 2 minor traders at Soc Gen, nobody went to jail because everybody was implicated. And they're implicated in a very interesting way. The mantra that American regulators usually talk about it as a sequence is bail, fail, send to jail. And what we did this time was bail, fail a little bit, and then change the subject. That's pretty much what we did. What we did was put together the world's largest class-specific put option. So what's that? Well, a put option is a contract whereby the guy who writes the contract gets to or sells the contract to someone else. The guy on the other side gets to pick where and when at a pre-agreed price they cash it in. Think of it as a form of insurance. So what was the financial crisis? Well, here's the bit where we're all guilty, and it's a horrible thing to say, but it's true, particularly for people like me. So how am I to blame for the financial crisis? Well, I have a mortgage. I live in Boston. I have a very, very nice apartment. It's really cool. You should come and see it sometime. It's really good. And it costs a bloody fortune. Now, here's the thing. My mortgage is my liability, but that's the bank's asset. If I went bankrupt, then unfortunately the bank would have my condo. My bank has no interest in a condo. That's a liability. They want the income stream from the mortgage again. That's the asset. All of our assets are the bank's liabilities. All of the bank's assets are our liabilities, and it all sums to zero. So when we bail out the banking sector, what we're really doing is bailing out the assets and incomes of the top 20% of the income distribution. All those pensions, all those 401ks, all those mortgages, all those insurance policies, all that you've got in your house, and me too, we got bailed. We don't like to see it that way, but it's true. We got bailed. Now, particularly the very top of that 20%, the top 2%, the top 1% really made out like bandits. And then when you do policies like quantitative easing, which lead to asset price distortion, and you have to have money in order to benefit from it, you can amplify the effects even further. But the key thing here is that we exercised a class-specific put option on the 80% of society that doesn't have assets. Because by bailing out all of those banks and bailing out all of our assets, we then turned round in horror and said, oh my God, look at all that debt we've accumulated. We've been spending like drunken sailors. This is terrible. The Greeks, oh, awful. George Osborne, austerity, we're going to become Greece. Oh, don't talk complete nonsense. You've got your own currency, for God's sake. Stop behaving like a child. But nonetheless, it worked. And we got to basically turn on everybody down below us, the ones who rely on government transfers, the ones who need public sector employment, the ones whose incomes and assets are way thinner than ours, and say, oh, look at all that debt we need to cut. We need to cut. Not me. I'm not paying bailout insurance. I'm not paying higher taxes. They're going to take it. So we constructed a giant class-specific put option on the bottom 80% of the income distribution. Not very nice, but true. I did mention I'm from Dundee. So what does this bode for the future of Europe? Let me give you the happy story. The happy story goes like this. There was a thing called the Asset Quality Review, whereby all of the bank's assets were examined by teams of bank examiners by 8 months ago. And it wasn't clear what that was for, because I thought what they were going to do was basically take one bank out in every country and sort of say, you've been really naughty, and smack it and put it in the naughty step, and all. None of that happened. What they're actually doing is finding out where all of those bad assets were. Remember I mentioned the 1.22 trillion in non-performing loans? They want to know where they are. Why? Because what are they doing just now? They're doing a thing called quantitative easing, whereby you're basically giving people, what you're basically trying to do is you're trying to buy every government bond that isn't nailed down. Now, this can worked well for the Americans, worked reasonably well for the Brits, to a certain extent, but it's not going to work in the Eurozone. Why not? Because yields, the interest rate, the return that you're currently getting on assets is so low that if you're sitting on a German bond that's yielding 3%, no matter how much the central bank offers to you to take it off your hands, they're paying you in a devaluing currency. The euro's lost 12% of its value in about 3 months, and it's going to get worse. So if I've got a choice between holding onto a real rate of return of 3% or buying a bunch of devaluing cash and then buying something else that's yielding 0.3%, why would I do it? So what they're going to have to do is go private. They're going to have to go buy private sector assets. That's why you want the AQR, because that's when you know where it all is. And then you securitize this, and you put it all in the ECB's balance sheet, and then you can really do some quantitative easing damage. Add to this something called the Targeted LTRO program, and something that was also in the news called the Juncker Plan. And basically what you're going to get is a very, very large boost to actual spending in Europe. Now, there's been a de facto easing up on austerity. Basically, the French have told the Germans, we're going to run a budget deficit screw you, and they're going to, and basically it's working. So that's going to continue. You see the big countries loosening a little bit in this one. The Italians never do austerity. They don't even have a word for it. So the Juncker plan is very important because what it is basically a big bag of magic euros that currently has 20 billion euros in it. And it's meant to be levered up to about 330 billion. Now, how are you going to get the private sector to invest in this? Well, think about it. Quantitative easing, yields are on the floor, the currency is devaluing. Imagine if 6 months from now, the European Commission comes along and says, hey, got something for you. It's an infrastructure bond. 10 years guaranteed rate of return, 3.5%. How much money is going to go flying into that? Everything. So this is how you can do fiscal policy at a European level, bypassing all the stupid restrictions they've got with debt breaks and all the rest of the stuff they signed in 2012, which is fiscal suicide. So there is a plan. There's easing up on austerity. Only the Greeks are really, really in trouble, and that's a whole conversation we can have. Cheaper oil is good for consumption. This is giving everything a boost. QE will have a big effect. And the whole thing is ultimately a giant devaluation play because it means that Europe gets to run a trade surplus against the rest of the world with a cheaper currency while they're growing. So if you can basically put the Greek situation to one side, the future for Europe actually is getting better. Everything that I've done, everything I've walked you through, is how we got into this mess. A huge amount of policy errors, really bad ideas being implemented, the whole lot. But now it's a positive story, or at least it's more positive than it's been since the crisis. However, as I mentioned, I'm from Dundee, which means I'm chronically depressed. So here's the scenario too, is that all going to get worse. And the problem is, ultimately, when you're left with the central bank being the only real policy-making institute that's left in the world, basically, it's a strange position to be in because parliaments sit around and tweet and don't do anything and don't do fiscal policy. You're in a kind of a weird world because all central banks can do is 2 tricks. They can raise and lower the price of money and it's already on the floor, and they can buy and sell assets, and they're going to start doing that with public assets, and they're going to move to private assets, right? But at the end of the day, what you're doing is trying to solve fiscal problems with monetary instruments, and it's not clear that you can really do this. I mean, you can lead a bank to liquidity, but that doesn't mean you can make them lend, particularly if the environment is already depressed. And if you have kind of depressed, if you will, deflationary expectations locked in, and that seems to be the case in parts of the European South, you can chuck as much liquidity as you want. You can keep it liquid, but you're not actually going to get into a higher growth path. The QE effects will be limited. As I said, there's an asset supply and asset type problem. And then something even scarier is Thomas Piketty's work, not the inequality stuff, his work on growth. If you actually do get a chance to read the book, and it's huge, the really important part's actually chapters 2 through 5, because what he does is he reformulates what's called the solo growth model. Chucks out technology, brings in demography, basically. And his long-run calculations is that European long-run growth rates are going to converge, or rather regress to about 1.2 to 1.4% growth a year. Now, when you're running 90% debt thresholds and you're growing at 1.2 a year, you have to have a very, very high rate of investment in order to basically get your growth track up enough to pay that debt off. And those figures look like they're not going to do it. Wrong, given this, and go back to the politics, what you have are very, very high unemployment rates. You've got creditor-debtor standoffs, both internationally, across the Eurozone and within countries. Look at the poverty figures that came out for Scotland last week. They were absolutely shocking. 820,000 people in this country are in poverty. Right? Now, put this again back in terms of the 1970s, that terrible decade where things couldn't continue. 5 times as many people in Britain are in poverty today than they were in the 1970s. And the economy is twice the size as it was in the 1970s. So we're on average richer, but the average is completely meaningless because the distribution is so skewed. When you have that type of world, if you have a deflationary world with that type of income skew, you get the politics of the SNP, if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you get the politics of the National Front. And the notion that this is all going to go away, people are going to sober up and they'll start voting for the centre parties again. Look at what's happening to the Labour Party. It is collapsing because its own support base doesn't believe a word it says anymore. And this is true for the German Social Democrats. It's true for the centre-left throughout all of Europe. So what the tail risk in this one is the politics. It's not the economics, exactly as you said in the introduction. The economics makes a certain set of politics possible. And the progressive example of that is actually the conversation that Scotland had last year. The regressive example of that is all too plain to see in the periphery of Europe. Now, how is this going to play out? I'm not sure, but the one thing I do know is this. Nobody votes for a 15-year recession, not even in Bear's Den. And I will leave you with that sobering thought. Thank you. Can't believe I'm describing the SNP as progressive.
Let's see.
So questions, answers,
so time
things.
for,
Somebody's going to come down and pick up a couple of mics,
yes.
and then they will bring the microphone to you.
Okay.
Lovely.
All right.
So you can run all the way right to the back
Right at
again,
the
because
red-
there's a guy up there.
There you go. So Laura's at the top, Thomas is at the bottom. Questions, comments, clarifications,
Contentions.
contentions?
Stephen Watson, fabulous talk, really enjoyed that. I'm interested in how the politics of austerity is going to play out, given the general election that's coming up. In particular, the tension between a Conservative Party that characterised any coalition with the SNP, and these are the words of Cameron in the House of Commons last week, as despicable. How that's going to play out if one finds oneself with a large cohort of SNP members of Parliament and a majority Conservative Party that's run a campaign now and will continue to, which is threatening English voters with Scottish domination. So how do you think that's going to play out in economic and political terms?
Anybody's guess on how this one's going to play out. I love the fact that Ed is basically sort of ruling out he's ruling out his last best hope for victory. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. But you have to understand why he's doing it, of course, because if he doesn't, he's stabbing Scottish Labour MPs in the back, right? So he can't do that, right? So, you know, the politics get very complex very quickly. It's, you know, this what we're seeing here across all of Europe is kind of the collapse of centre party votes, particularly the centre left. Because, you know, they've been, when I gave a speech to the SDP about a month ago, and I referred to them, and they really didn't like this at all, as the second-rate enforcers of a creditor's paradise. And that's kind of what they've become. So, I mean, if you think about the way that Labour's telling the story, it's like, you know, Ed comes out and does his conference speech, and he's like all about something, you know, change the conversation, blah, blah, blah. And then the press just come after him. What about the deficit? What about the deficit? And of course, if you had any sense, he'd say the only reason the economy is growing because of the deficit. Stop. This is nonsense. But he doesn't. He goes, oh, yes, you're right, terrible. Deficit, I have to do something about it. So it reminds me of the way the Democrats behave in the United States, right? Because it's sort of like the Republicans are like, bomb everyone, and the Democrats are like, oh, that's popular. Bomb someone. Right? It's this kind of like half-assed version of the same thing. And if all you end up going to be is like a half-assed version of the same thing that nobody wants, why would you vote for it? So, I mean, that's why I'm very pessimistic on centre-left chances. I just don't think they have any credibility anymore. Next.
Yes. Wait. First of all.
Mark, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. Could you tell me about your scenario one? Because, as you said, I mean, you put a caveat at the end. You said monetary expansion will only work for as long as there isn't effectively a beggar thy neighbour type response from other United States, other parts of the world. So, I mean, where do you see Europe going in a sense? Do you see continued movement to try and pool sovereignty and therefore rearm, if you like, the fiscal arm of government, or not? And if so, would you like to speculate where all that might go?
I think the Juncker plan is going to prove to be very important because what it is a disguised euro bond, if they manage to do it. So the infrastructure bond becomes the euro bond in all but name, you know, so it's the love that cannot speak its name. So that will prove to be that's fiscal policy on a you know, a European level, and is very important. How much you can go forward towards integration? Well, you know, once you've kind of poisoned the well to the extent has been done because of austerity politics, I mean, the minute the Swabian housewife came out and got paraded up against the lazy Greeks, I mean, it was just going to get ugly from that point. It's very hard to take those words back, particularly when what's actually happened, and I hope I've tried to convince you on this one, is it's a banking crisis. We just bailed the banks again, right? I mean, that's really what it was all about. So Merkel's not going to go up and sort of stand there one day and go, "Aye, remember all that stuff about lazy Greeks and all that? Turns out it was total bullshit. Actually, we bailed out the banks. What do you think? Vote for me," right? That's never going to happen. So it's very difficult, discursively, if you want to put it that way, to get out of the rhetorical position you've built and turn it around in a progressive way, which is why we're seeing basically a kind of loosening of austerity policy without an actual explicit rejection of it, because the reputation costs are going to be really, really high for all the people who've invested in it if we actually turn around to everyone and said, oh, sorry you lost your job and all that, totally pointless, should have just had a better central bank, you know, not going to work too well. So is it going to go forward progressively with more European integration? At this point, I wouldn't bet on it. If anything, if the sort of inflationary, deflationary politics works out, what you're seeing is a renationalization of politics and an attempt to basically, through a claim of representation and democracy, in a sense, domesticate markets once again. It's that pullback from the international. And that has both, you know, from a centre-left perspective, has a sort of like progressive feature to it, but also a very regressive feature to it as well. Because what you end up doing is you will end up basically reducing the potential pool for investment and so on and so forth. So, you know, there are costs with closure as well as the security that comes with it. So it's very much a mixed bag.
Just a reminder, it's good if you could tell us who you are when you ask your question and speak into the microphone so we'll be able to have your question as well as the answer recorded.
Gentlemen,
yeah.
And then
David Budinski, Volker. You mentioned the Bretton Woods Agreement in passing earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When Nixon abolished the agreement in '71, don't you think that was a defining moment in Western economies?
It was defining in a very unusual way. And for those of you who are not sort of au fait with international monetary arrangements, basically Bretton Woods was, the gold standard existed when everybody's fixed the gold. That turned out to be ludicrously, insanely deflationary and fragile, and it blew up in the 1930s. So after the war, the Americans pegged to gold and everybody else pegged to the dollar, and this lasted basically for about 30 years. Eventually what happened was the French screwed it up, because they always do, is they went along to Fort Knox with a big bag of dollars and said, give us the gold. And the Americans went, how much have we got? Not that much. Oh, shit. So basically by 71, the pressure became unbearable, and they basically said, if you don't like a modified gold standard, try having a paper standard. And they just basically broke the link to gold, and we're in the world we're in now. So absolutely a defining moment, right? But it can also, I mean, you can get sort of like, you know, too much into this in terms of like, oh, it needs to be anchored to gold, you know. It's a shiny rock. I mean, a third of it's like stuck on the necks of Indian peasants. I mean, it's got a magical totemic effect, but ultimately it could be arbitrary. It could be anything that you peg your currency to. So, you know, a well-managed fiat currency doesn't freak me out. What really matters is the intergenerational capacity to tax. So long as I've got positive demographics, positive productivity, and positive growth, then my money, that dollar in my pocket, will still buy stuff 10 years from now. I don't need a shiny yellow rock. What matters is when you get really badly designed monetary arrangements. And the euro is a classic case because, in a sense, it's a bit like a gold standard because nobody gets to print it. And look at what's happening because of that, because you're taking macroeconomic policy tools right off the table before you start. So I think it's a defining moment, but I think of a defining moment for like different reasons from what you usually hear.
Alexei Garin. That was very emotional, I would say, talk. Probably one of the most emotional I have seen.
I was being quite restrained.
You introduced quite a few problems, but you don't propose any solutions. So what's your solution?
I don't do solutions, I'm Scottish.
I mean, apart from mixing different types of money, which constantly appeared in your talk, what's your ideal world? I mean, Eurozone is...
All right, say, like, imagine we had a time machine, right? If you go back to 2010, the cost of avoiding all of this was 50 billion euros. It was called buy all the Greek debt that was coming up for what's called rollover risk, right? Basically, they had to take some off the market and issue new stuff to cover it. 50 billion, right? It's now going to cost, best estimate I can come up with is the total cost of emergency liquidity assistance for the value of the Greek banking system, plus everything else they could steal on the way out the door if they decided to fall, probably about 700 billion. Right, so it's went from 50 to about 700 billion in terms of like the cost of if Greece were to default today. Not saying that they will, but that's one way to think about it. So we don't have a time machine. We're stuck with it. We've got those sunk costs. First one, stop squeezing. It's really simple. The only reason Spain is growing is because they've got someone to export to, and the people they're exporting to is France, because France is running a deficit. Deficits are not deadly, they are not toxic. They do not end up with everybody ending up as the Weimar Republic. This is just some kind of bizarre myth that we've bought into. So you can actually have fiscal policy loosening, which would lead to a higher growth track, which over the long run then gives you a more sustainable debt profile. So the best example of this is, again, Greece. They've lost 30% of GDP, their debts have skyrocketed rather than shrunk, and their economic model, to the extent that they had one, is broken beyond repair. They are completely insolvent. Now, if that's the case, stop squeezing, number one. Number two, have something like a Eurobond. Mutualize some risk. Get some bad assets off the banking system's books. The key thing is, and it's not even an infrastructure spend for the sake of it, although one should notice that, for example, the locks on the Kiel Canal are falling off. They could probably do with a bit of repair, right? So nonetheless, you could do infrastructure spend, but really it's just stop squeezing. This is all policy error. There's no need to do any of this, because what you're doing is you're treating a banking accident as a fiscal crisis. And you're then applying the wrong remedy for a fiscal crisis to a banking accident. Just stop doing it, and the whole thing will get a lot better. Really simple example of this. The United States didn't spend beyond the original $700 billion it did on the stimulus. And it even cut a little bit, but thankfully the sequester was tiny, $78 billion either side on a $17 trillion economy's pocket change, right? So they didn't cut. Gridlock meant the Republicans didn't get to do what the Europeans did voluntarily. Look at the difference in the growth profiles. They didn't spend, but they didn't cut. They grew 5 times as fast as the Eurozone last year. So just stop cutting. It's really simple.
Hi, I'm Murray from Glasgow. It's an incredible talk, thanks very much. But can you see a political situation in the next decade whereby the deregulation of the last 30 years is rolled back? So like a system of re-regulation, if you will, of the financial sector?
It's a tough one. You usually only really regulate the financial sector when it goes bankrupt. And it hasn't gone bankrupt because it got bailed out. So could you imagine another financial crisis coming along? I actually think the threats are overblown in terms of like there being another one just around the corner. But your political problem that comes from this is the increasing skewing of income. Because what you've got is collapsed real wages. I mean, wages in Britain are, depending on how you count it, 8 to 10% lower than they were in 2008. You've got a massive skewing of the income distribution, the top 1%. And policies such as quantitative easing, while effective on a macro level, basically make it worse. Because if you're going to distort the prices of houses and stocks and bonds and everything, then people who have the ability to buy and sell these things are the only ones that really make any money off of it. So to me, the 10-year problem is basically the kind of Pikettyan politics that come out of this. That you're looking at figures for Scotland, as I mentioned before, where you're 820,000 people living in poverty and a population of what's the population now? Just under 5 million? Just over 5 million? I mean, that's just shocking, right? And if the story is 10 years out, that's going to get bigger, right? They're going to get poorer, and the top's going to make off with even more of the income. That's when it becomes a political sustainability question. That goes well beyond regulation. That's no longer a regulatory question. The other thing with financial regulation is a lot of talk about macroprudential regulation, for those of you who want to geek out on that stuff. I was actually involved in some of the early work on that, and I've come to believe that basically it doesn't work. Or it's not the panacea we think it is. So what would be a macroprudential thing? It would be like you'd have some kind of measure of, let's say, housing index costs relative to wages, and it gets to a certain point and you'd make it more expensive for people to get mortgages. Well, the problem with this is there's lots of interlinkages in the economy we don't really understand. And there's a good example of this in Sweden, whereby they're like, Jesus, there's a huge housing bubble in Stockholm. The price-income multiples are huge. So they raised interest rates to try and cool this down, thinking that this would basically cool down the housing market. It just caused an economic slump. So they had a recession that they didn't need, and it didn't do anything to house prices, because as we saw in London, it just keeps going up. So because we don't really understand how these linkages work, again, regulation of these things is actually much tougher than we think. Gentleman there.
George English. Basically what I want to ask you is, what do you think, A, the UK, and particularly Scotland, should do economically? And you mentioned politics and economics. We have politicians trying to get us to believe certain things. Interestingly enough, last year the Herald supported independence right up to the last moment, when you had this lovely quote, a Panglossian emphasis on the best case scenario has strained its credibility. The second example, the NHS. Apparently that was the second biggest issue for independence. And again, we got a flyer last week. The last 7 years, the Scottish Government has worked hard to look after the Scotland's NHS, record health spending, knowing full well that real spending has fallen by 1%, while it's gone up by 4% in England. So, comments on that field?
All right, so there's another story which is going on here as well as the inequality one. There's an intergenerational story, and it goes like this. The United States spends 17.7% of GDP on healthcare. Right, that's utter madness, right? Now, at the same time, it's not, because it tells me what I need to invest in to ensure a very comfortable retirement, which is go long big pharma and healthcare stocks, right? Straightforward. So, of course, I'm not a 1% or maybe a 2%er, I can do that, I can get away with that, but everybody else gets screwed. Now, if you're spending that much money on healthcare, what's going to happen to investment? Now, who are the people who vote? Britain's a brilliant example of this. The turnout difference between the young and the old is absolutely huge. I think it's the biggest across the OECD. So pensioners vote. Now, what is it that George's been doing all the past couple of weeks? Pensioners, have more, have even more stuff. Take your annuities, go on a cruise, do whatever you want. I don't care, just vote for me, right? So pensioners vote a lot, and it's almost impossible to cut their benefits. So if you want to cut, you have to cut something else. So think about what's happened to the British welfare budget. $72 billion and 72 billion pounds in cuts. 27 billion of those cuts fell on 3 programs that primarily hit disabled people. Right, that's the reality of the spending cuts, because there are certain things that are sacrosanct. And old people are sacrosanct because they've worked their whole lives and they get their pensions. Yeah, also because they vote way more than young people. So young people's ability to form assets, to basically do what their parents did, are necessarily curtailed because they're spending so much money on the old. Now, nobody wants to talk about this, but it's a fact. Now, are the old meant to take a hit for this? Well, they're not going to. And eventually, as all of us will, they'll slip the mortal coil. But what they'll do in the meantime is basically take a huge amount of national income and spend it. And while that's good in a macroeconomic sense, nobody benefits from having like lots and lots of old poor people. It's great that they spend their pensions. But it also means there's less money going to go into things like equity markets, because old people buy bonds, they don't buy equities. So your net rate of investment is going to go down simply by demography. We see this all over Europe. So there's a real mixed bag here in terms of how this plays out. So it's not just the apparent. There's lots of other transfer issues across generations as well as across classes. And all societies are having to deal with this. So just more stuff. Microphone, please. And then behind.
Hi, I'm Brian Gervin, Glasgow. Something about the politics of this. Again, I mean, you mentioned the emergence of insurgent parties. Perhaps not all of them, but most of them are strongly nationalist in one form or another, whether left or right is perhaps not that big an issue. But does that seem to you to lead back into, I mean, you mentioned this, the renationalization issue, because, I mean, 50% of Greeks now say they think Greece would be better off outside the EU, or just under 50%, I think it's 48 or 49%, something like that, the last figure I saw. In Britain, it's 40-something%. In Sweden, it's 40-something%. It's only the core EU states where you have relatively high levels of support for the EU. So I think there's perhaps 2 questions linked here. One of them is whether the EU has any future at all in reality, and all we're looking at really is it being burnt out at the end of this because it simply can't sustain the promise that it's made. And the second one is, you mentioned Polanyi, although you didn't discuss him in detail. I mean, one of the points he makes is that in times of crisis, and his model was the Industrial Revolution, what societies do is they create ways of negotiating with capital or with the state. That hasn't happened. The insurgent parties are there, but you don't have that emergence of social democratic politics like you had in the 1930s, or the emergence of trade unions in the 19th century. It seems to me, looking across Europe, and indeed looking across the advanced industrial world, there's very little politically that challenges the type of consensus that you've described, particularly the sort of severe German anti-inflation consensus. And I just wondered whether you had anything to offer on that type of...
On the last point, I think there is a lot going on. It's just that it doesn't look like what we would look for, right? Because we're old. So we look for unions and we look for things like that, and they don't exist. 7.9% of the private sector workforce in the United States is in a union. And yet they still get blamed for stuff. It's hilarious, right? But they're not in there. So those types of social movements that we're used to are just not there. But young people in Podemos don't need unions to organize. They need Twitter. So I really think there's a very, very different politics that's emerging, and it's cross-class, but it's skewed towards the bottom, and it's overwhelmingly young. And if you have a look, I mean, from looking at it from me, from the point of view of sitting in the United States, looking at the referenda debate, the way I made sense of it was pretty straightforward. If I was living here and I was under the age of 30, and I'd basically raised in an environment where I had easy access to credit, which has now become rather pernicious debt, my real wages have stagnated, my opportunities are limited, and I'm told that I need to do more with less. And then on the other hand, I've got a bunch of people who are over 50 who own everything and are totally fine. Guess which way the vote went? Everybody who had assets wanted to stay with the status quo. Everybody who was on naive hope, right, selling naive hope, they were the ones who were basically living for hope because they don't have any assets. So when you break it down that way, you know, you end up in a very different space. I think there's a lot going on with young people. We just don't have the eyes to see it.
That's true, but there isn't a policy.
No, not give it time. Give it time. Give it time. I mean, how old is Podemos? Give it a chance. You know, let it go. I mean, you know, have to let these things go a little bit, right? On the other point, I'm going to invoke Katy Perry because I always like to do this. So I call this the Katy Perry problem. Whenever somebody says to me, it's amazing. So it's like 48% of Greeks now don't want to be in the euro, yet there's another poll that basically says 80% of them do want to be in the euro, but they want to be out of where they are just now. It doesn't make any sense, right? So I'm 100% committed to being in a relationship with Katy Perry. That's never going to happen either. People want stuff all the time. It doesn't mean anything in terms of what's actually possible as to what can happen in terms of the agenda of options. Although I'm still holding out for Katie. I mean, if she went for Russell Brand, maybe there's hope for me. You know, you never know. Microphone to this gentleman first, please.
Mike Morris from Glasgow. What's your opinion on offshore tax havens and how do they influence the situation? Because they seem to have enormous funds, far, far greater than any national government, and yet they seem to be able to operate without any difficulty whatsoever in the world, and they influence everything that you have suggested. And so I'd like your opinions on that, please. Thank you.
Big topic. By one estimate, there's $29 trillion in funds hidden in offshore accounts. That's more than enough to solve the Eurozone crisis, the unemployment crisis, the investment crisis 2 times over. So we just need to get our hands on it. Governments are looking for more revenue. My favourite example of a tax haven actually isn't, Bermuda, it's Ireland. And London. And London, absolutely. And in fact, most of the world's money laundering is done through London, not through the Cayman Islands. It's very difficult to do it in the Cayman Islands because everybody's looking. Whereas in London, it's incredibly easy to take money out of Russia, stick it in a Latvian bank, send it to Sweden, send that to London, and buy a mansion. Money laundering on a global scale. So it's much more complicated than simply looking at the tax havens themselves, right? But they're looking. I mean, the Loch-Earn Declaration was one thing, tightening up on sort of double Irish strategies and double Dutch and all that sort of stuff is there. So we need more revenue. They're coming after it. But, the limits on this are as follows. The following 2 statistics are absolutely true, because it's about me. In 2010, I paid more income tax than Bank of America paid total tax. I mean, that's true, right? In 2012, I paid more tax in the United States in income tax than American Airlines. What the? I mean, seriously, right? I mean, come on, that's not even funny, right? So that has to be redressed on some level, and it will be. It will be. Whether we'll get all the way to 29 trillion, I don't know, but we'll get our hands on a wee bit of it. How? By shutting them down. But then again, you're shutting down London, so that's a tough one. It's not about being mean to, the Cayman Islands or whatever. It's basic. Well, I'll tell you a simple one is basically stop. The Irish will still have the 12.5% corporation tax rate, which allows them to book Google's profits as a services export, which is a nice trick, right? But the problem with these strategies is everybody tries to do it. The SNP. Remember that whole thing about you'd have a more competitive corporation tax? That's beggar thy neighbour against everybody else, right? So the problem with tax haven strategies is a bit like Switzerland. Just as I have the Katy Perry problem, I have the not Switzerland problem. Has anybody ever been to Switzerland? It's a very nice place, isn't it? Bloody expensive, but very nice. The reason Switzerland's a nice place is because everybody else is not Switzerland, right? If everybody tried to be a tax haven and pharma hub, guess what? It wouldn't work. So for Switzerland to be Switzerland, everybody else has to be not Switzerland, right? We can't all play the corporation tax game, and we're all going to try to. That might actually be more conducive to bringing about change than anything else, because it simply can't work in the aggregate. But do I think we're going to like suddenly wake up and raise billions? Probably not. Gentleman here, and then lady there.
Thank you. John Mackay.
Oh, you were there as well. Forgot that. I'm going to get a microphone to you next. Sorry about that.
I don't pretend to have understood very much of that.
Good, because it was all lies. Smoke and mirrors, the whole lot.
I'm one of your old folk who's fairly asset rich, but bought enthusiastically into the Yes campaign. So I don't know if that's...
Whoa, that does make... Yeah, exactly. I'd look for therapy on that one.
Yes. I don't know if this is a simple question. Do you rate Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney and their economic policy? Because that's an aspect of the SNP that I don't understand, although I've bought totally into the SNP.
Ooh, I knew somebody would ask me this one. Well, I rate them as much as I rate any of the others. How about that? All right, here's the deal. Oil prices have went down by 30%. If you were an independent country de facto today without your own currency, you would use the pound. You'd be fine. They can't actually come into your house and take the pounds back, right? So the whole thing, if you don't get to use the pound, is just bullshit, right? Forget about that, right? You could be insane and join the euro. If you did, you would become Latvia on the Clyde in a heartbeat, right? So just don't do that. It's a really bad idea. But to do the stuff that Nicola and these people want to do is you need your own currency. You really need your own currency. And getting there's a multi-year project. Now, you would have a structural budget deficit with the collapse in oil prices of about 7 to 8% of GDP. If you were on your own trying to fund the levels of transfers that we want to as a society here, that's a really difficult trick to pull off. The only way you could do that is by a lot of borrowing, and your credit rating would be different from the English and so on and so forth. And you would have to do some medium-term fiscal consolidation, blah, blah, blah. So you might be able to turn yourself into Norway or Sweden, but it's going to take you 10 to 15 years to even get close to starting the project. And that's the unfortunate truth that nobody really wanted to fess up to. So it was kind of like hope versus chronic pessimism, right? That was kind of, the way that the debate was structured. And it really should have been something along the lines of, look, where we are is kind of untenable. I mean, 820,000 people in poverty, that's just ridiculous, right? And it's not just about pumping more money out of the London financial sector and then giving it to poor people. We need a growth strategy. You need an actual sustainable growth strategy for the country. It's a different place. If you're going to go down that line, be honest about it. And say it's basically a 15-year project. It's going to hurt like hell at first, but stay the course and keep the faith. That would, to me, would be the credible thing to do and to signal. And to say that you want your own currency. If you're not doing all that, you're kind of faking it. Here.
Okay, so I'll ask a naive question because I'm a psychologist, but I recently heard Andy Haldane, Chief Economist, Bank of England, in London, talking about the financial problems, it's stuff like that. Anyway, so one of the things that he listed as a potential explanation was the hubris of the decision makers, the individuals. I just wanted to know, I mean, you're talking about everything in terms of economics and social level and so on, but how much do you think that might actually count for something, the personalities of the people that have brought us into this situation?
Well, there was that bloke that ran the big bank here. What was his name again? Right, exactly. They removed it, you had a knighthood, got it back, took it, all that sort of stuff, right? Yeah, but I mean, here's the thing. So in the book, which I encourage you all to buy so I can join the 1%, in the book, I basically make a point that greed is a constant and crises are variables. So you can't really explain a variable with a constant. So, but let me say, that's sort of insufficient as an explanation, because what happens, I think, is hubris develops because we think we know more than we do. And the reason that we think we know more than we do is because the future seems to be very, very stable. It really does track the past quite well. And if you go basically from the period of sort of cool Britannia and Tony Blair in 1997, you had a 10-year period where it looked like, to all intents and purposes, the global economy was on a rip. Even with 9/11, even with the slowdown there in America, everything was going great. If you had houses, you had assets, people were doubling up, flipping, the whole lot. So basically we had, as Robert Lucas, the economist, said in the United States in 2004, to all intents and purposes, the central problem of depression prevention has been solved. Ben Bernanke, the guy who basically invents QE on the fly, writes an essay in 2003 called The Great Moderation that says that we've figured it out. We now, in a combination of inflation targeting, a couple of other tricks, we've tamed the business cycle. Gordon Brown himself said, we've tamed the business cycle. That's hubris on an epic scale. So I think it is important. I think it's really important. But I don't think it comes from personal characteristics. I think it comes from the fact that we kind of feed off each other in a network sense. And if everybody's getting their priors kind of like reinforced, then it creates an over-optimistic bias. And you have an inability to see blind spots. And that's kind of the way that things got channeled. And there's a fair amount of work in behavioral economics and also in psychology that backs that up. So yes, that's how I think about it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh. Yes, that's right, it was you. Nope, down here. We'll get you as well. Nope, one more. Keep your hand up, there you go. You have to put your hand up, they're not psychic. They're really good, but they're not psychic. I think it's over here.
Hello, I'm a student at the University of Glasgow, and I was just wondering, you were referring time and time again to Greece and austerity in Greece, though you never explained why was it that austerity became such a commonly accepted thing and such a commonly accepted practice, and why then the finger pointing to Greece was so effective and so accepted?
Well, they're two different issues. Why is it so effective? Partly because it's common sense, right? You spent too much, then, stop spending. The thing is, in order for anyone to save, there has to be an income generated from which to save. So if everybody saves at once, you get the collapse in income, and therefore the whole thing's pointless. But that always takes one extra step to explain. So if you basically walk out with the Swabian housewife story, the Swabian housewife knows how to run the macroeconomy. Really? Does she? That's kind of awesome, because macroeconomists don't. That kind of like political common sense really sort of, sells. So there's one, right? Second one's latent racial prejudice. I mean, basically thrifty Protestants in the north and you lazy Catholics and Orthodox Southerners, all that sort of stuff. So you can throw some sort of sociological stuff in there as well. There's the fact that basically you do have a lot of debt going around the system, and different countries look at it in different ways. So the German word for debt is Schuld, which is the same word as guilt. There you go. The Italian word the English word for credit comes from the Italian word credere, which is belief and faith, right? So the way that you even think about this, of course, feeds into this in a very important way, right? So all of that's there. Now, why was it accepted? It wasn't accepted, it was imposed. Let us remember that there were two constitutional coups d'etats took place, one in Greece and one in Italy, to make this stuff stick. Nobody's voted for this. Nobody actually said, this is a great idea, let's smash national income by 30%. You give it a chance because you're told it's the only thing to do. You vote in an election, you don't like the guys, you throw out somebody else, you get the same guys again, because basically the policy never changes despite who you vote for. Now, to me, Greece is really important for one reason, not because it's economically important, it's not. We used to say in the United States, Greece is the same size as Alabama, who gives a damn about Alabama? It's now 2/3 the size of Alabama, so it doesn't even matter as much as that. It matters politically for what it represents. Because what it represents is basically a rising of the non-traditional left. And the centre left in Europe are absolutely terrified because they've seen their vote share for the past 10 years going down and down and down. And as I mentioned before, when you become the second-rate enforcers of a creditor's paradise, why should anybody vote for you? So what Syriza and Podemos, and on the right, the National Front and others represent, is a way of basically bypassing the system and expressing a set of beliefs and desires which the mainstream parties are unable to articulate or unwilling to articulate. So Greece is a threat because of what it represents politically. If they hold on for 6 months and basically you manage to get Podemos in a serious position to challenge the Spanish mainstream, if you get a reaction in Italy along the same lines, then basically you really are kicking over the apple cart of European politics, and that's what they're afraid of. So Greece has to be bought off, cauterized, sanitized, or otherwise disposed of, because you're too dangerous. And you will be.
Thank you. And although we have a bit of an austerity regime going when it comes to time, and we have to close, I want to say that we do not have an austerity regime going when it comes to drink and conversation in the foyer. So I would like to invite everyone to please do stick around, have a conversation, talk to Mark if you'd like to, and finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank Mark Blyth for a really, really interesting, exciting, challenging, and mind-bending talk.
Thank you very much.
And a final marketing ploy, there are flyers for this book out in the foyer as well.